Honourable Minister of Citizenship and Immigration.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm very proud to rise in this debate on Bill C-49, an act to prevent to the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, rather, so that we can fight against very serious crimes of human smugglers.
I'm pleased to introduce this bill. Let me begin by saying that Canada obviously is very proud of its long tradition, of being a place of migration for people from around the world. We receive more newcomers than any other country in the developed world, 0.8% of our population every year as new permanent residents. We are also proud of our long humanitarian tradition of being a place of protection and refuge for victims of persecution and of violence, those who need our protection. This goes back long into our history, in fact, Madam Speaker, to the days of the arrival of the United Empire Loyalists, the Black Loyalists, the Underground Railroad, the Eastern European refugees before the war, the refugees from Hungary and Soviet and communist oppression after the war, and indeed, of course, most famously, the Indo-Chinese who arrived coming here by over 60,000 who were welcomed by Canadians in 1979 and 1980. This underscores our long and deep humanitarian tradition as a place of protection. Canada receives more resettled refugees than any other developed country in the world. In fact, this is so important to Canadians that our government announced earlier this year an increase of 20% in the number of resettled refugees who we will receive. That means that beginning next year, we will welcome some 14,000 refugees in need of our protection each and every year. That, of course, is in addition to those who come to Canada making asylum claims, which claims are assessed by our Immigration Refugee Board and through various appeals and administrative appeals in our legal system. Madam Speaker, one of the problems which this Parliament recognized has been the problem of abuse of that asylum system, which is why Bill C-11, the Balanced Refugee Reform Act, was adopted unanimously by this Parliament following all-party cooperation in the spring in order to significantly speed up the process of refugee determination, providing protection to bona fide refugees, and the removal of those who seek to abuse Canada's generosity. However, Madam Speaker, Canadians are deeply concerned with a particularly pernicious crime, a crime that exploits vulnerable people in their dream to come to Canada, the dangerous crime of human smuggling. In the past year, it's well known that Canada has received 2 large vessels on our west coast, together carrying nearly 600 illegal migrants to our shores, people who had, based on our intelligence, paid criminal smuggling syndicates some $50,000 each in order to come to Canada in the worst way possible, in the most dangerous and exploitative way possible. Madam Speaker, the remarkable openness of Canada to immigration in general and refugee protection in particular, which makes possible our very generous approach to immigration, is dependent on public confidence in the system. And I submit that Canadians demand an immigration system that is characterized by a sense of fair play and the rule of law. What disturbs them deeply about these mass illegal smuggling operations is precisely that they undermine those principles of fundamental fairness and the rule of law. And so the position of Canadians, the position of this government, is and ought to be that we will be a country of openness. We will be a country that provides protection to those who are in need of it. We will lead the world in the moral obligation of refugee protection. But we will not be treated like a doormat by criminal networks who seek to profit by, frankly, encouraging people to come to this country illegally in a fashion that puts themselves and others at mortal danger. Because, Madam Speaker, we know that every year hundreds, potentially thousands of people around the world fall victim to the dangerous ruse of smuggling syndicates. Now, let me be very specific about the problem that we're facing and then allow me to identify the remedies, the strong but fair remedies that we propose in Bill C-49 and in certain associated operational actions undertaken by this government and its agencies. Firstly, Madam Speaker, I came back last month from a visit to Asia, including to Southeast Asia, where I met with counterparts in various foreign governments. I've, of course, met with our own Canadian intelligence, police, border security, and immigration officials, and learned a great deal about the vile trade of human smuggling in that region. What I learned, Madam Speaker, is the following: that there are approximately 3 or 4 criminal syndicates who are operating in that region, who have a long history of being involved in the arms smuggling trade. Because there has been an end to hostilities in the Sri Lankan Civil War, those syndicates have now decided to smuggle and to traffic a different commodity, human beings. That is why they have changed, they refocused their logistical ability to selling people the opportunity to be smuggled illegally to Canada. Now, Madam Speaker, I have been told by our partners in the region that they believe that these particular syndicates have the capacity to deliver several large steel-hulled vessels with the ability to bring each hundreds of illegal smuggled migrants to Canada each year. That is to say, prospectively, thousands of people being smuggled to this country in this dangerous fashion. Now, Madam Speaker, this government, and any Minister of Immigration, as my friend from Toronto knows well, has a profound responsibility to maintain public confidence in the immigration system. What we have seen since the arrival of the last smuggling vessel is a fundamental and very disturbing decline in public support for immigration in general and refugee protection in particular. According to the most recent polling that I have seen, over 60% of Canadians say that our response to this threat to our sovereignty, our laws, and the fairness of our immigration system should be to prohibit these vessels from entering Canadian territorial waters. 55% of Canadians have said that even if these vessels land and some of their passengers subsequently obtain refugee protection under our laws, that those people should be returned to their country of origin, notwithstanding a positive legal determination on their asylum claim. That is the public opinion environment, Madam Speaker. Imagine how much more vigorous Canadians would feel about this if we actually had several vessels arriving, which I am informed is within the logistical capability of the criminal organizations involved. We cannot allow that to happen, Madam Speaker. The easier path is to do nothing. The easier path is to mouth platitudes. The easier path is to take no difficult decisions. But, Madam Speaker, the necessary and responsible path is to take firm and meaningful action that does everything we reasonably and legally can to deter and disrupt the smuggling networks, to reduce both the pull and the push factors in this illegal migration so that it stops. To do otherwise is to put at risk the broad public consensus which has historically existed in Canada in favor of immigration and refugee protection, and I will not allow that to happen on my watch as Minister of Immigration, Madam Speaker. Now, there are some who would have us believe that we can successfully deter the smuggling operations simply by focusing on the smugglers. How I wish that were true, Madam Speaker. How I wish it were true that we did not have to, at the same time, address, quite frankly, the demand side of the equation in the smuggling enterprise. But to pretend that that is the case, to pretend that we can avoid disincentivizing the customers of the syndicates from paying $50,000 to come to Canada is naive in the extreme. So, Madam Speaker, let me present to you the general approach of the government and then the legislation in particular. Firstly, it is evident that there are legitimate refugees in the need of protection in Southeast Asia. It is also true that, according to the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees, it is always preferable to find a local or regional protection solution for those who are bona fide refugees, and to do everything possible to avoid them from becoming from being exploited by trafficking syndicates. That is why we have begun preliminary discussions with our international partners, including Australia, which obviously has a great stake in this issue, and with the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees to pursue the possibility of some form of regional protection framework in the Southeast Asian region. And that would, Madam Speaker, in part entail encouraging the countries now being used as transit points for smuggling and trafficking to offer at least temporary protection to those deemed by the UN in need of protection, and then for countries such as Canada to provide, to some extent, reasonable resettlement opportunities for those deemed to be bona fide refugees. And that is something that we are pursuing, Madam Speaker. But that, to be honest, is a mid to long-term solution. Working on that with the UN and our international partners will not stop the fact that as we speak, criminal networks in Southeast Asian countries are planning to smuggle their customers to Canada. They are in the process right now. There are people who have already paid their upfront fee, who are sitting in waiting positions in parts of Southeast Asia. There are vessels that have been acquired. There are officials who have been, shall we say, induced to cooperate with these networks. The operations are not abstract. This is not a possibility. This is not a theory. This is a real, present reality. And, Madam Speaker, we must react with real, present, current action to disincentivize the smuggling networks. It's also true, I acknowledge, that insofar as we're talking about so far a flow of mass illegal smuggled migrants of Tamil origin, we acknowledge that Canadians have a stake in seeing a just and durable peace in Sri Lanka. We acknowledge that the Tamil people have legitimate aspirations and that they deserve to be protected from violence and persecution. And that is why, through the Department of Foreign Affairs, our High Commission in Colombo, and through multilateral institutions, we continue to strongly encourage the government of Sri Lanka to make every effort to find a just resolution to the legitimate aspirations of its Tamil minority. That is one important issue. Regional protection framework is another important issue. Perhaps the most important element in combating the smuggling, Madam Speaker, is to stop the boats from leaving the transit countries in the first place. That is why our government has directed the relevant security and intelligence agencies to increase their presence and capability in the transit countries, partly to assist the transit countries in improving their capacity to detect fraudulent documents, to detect the smuggling networks, and to gather better and actionable intelligence to prevent people from, frankly, being loaded onto the vessels in the first place. In this respect, Madam Speaker, I would note that 2 weeks ago, the Royal Thai Police detained some 150 individuals who were in their country illegally without status, who apparently were planning to board vessels to be smuggled, possibly to Canada. So that work is being done as well, Madam Speaker. There is increased and improved police and intelligence cooperation in the region between ourselves, the Australians, and the transit countries. However, should a vessel successfully leave a transit country, and we're talking about these leaky, decommissioned cargo vessels that people are loaded onto like cattle to take the dangerous voyage across the Pacific, should they arrive in our territorial waters, let me be absolutely clear. Canada, after the adoption of C-49, will continue to fully honor our humanitarian, domestic, and international legal obligations to provide refugee protection. We will not endanger the lives of people, Madam Speaker, as some would have us do, to prevent them from entering Canadian waters, and nor will we violate our international obligations under the Convention for Refugees and Torture, nor our domestic obligations under the Charter of Rights to provide protection to those who are deemed by our legal system to be in need of it, to have a well-founded fear of persecution in their country of origin. That is to say, we will not, in the technical term, refoul, send back to the country of origin someone who has arrived even through this dangerous, illegal, and irregular form of marine migration. Having said that, Madam Speaker, we do need to send a strong message to the smugglers, which is why C-49 proposes strong mandatory minimum prison sentences for those involved in the smuggling operations. Those who are involved in smuggling under 50 people would face a mandatory minimum prison sentence of at least 3 years. If there are one of two aggravating factors involved, they would face a mandatory minimum of 5 years. If the group is a larger group, over 50 individuals, they could face a mandatory minimum of 5 years unless there's an aggravating factor, such as having put the life or safety of their customers at danger, in which case a 10-year mandatory minimum. We believe that this will help to cause the smugglers and the crews that work for them to think twice before targeting Canada for their sordid trade. Now, Madam Speaker, we also propose massive new penalties for the ship owners, those who are at the back end of this business enterprise, this terrible criminal profit-making venture ought to know that they stand to lose millions of dollars if they acquire a ship to be used for this illicit purpose. Secondly, Madam Speaker, we broaden the ability to make it easier to obtain successful prosecutions against the people smugglers through amendments to the relevant law. And, Madam Speaker, we take other measures targeting the smugglers very clearly. However, let us be clear. When we're talking about an illicit market, one thing that history, common experience, and economics all tell us is that as long as there is a sufficient demand and a sufficient price, there will always be someone willing to provide a service or a good. And so we cannot be naive that we must about the imperative of diminishing the demand side of the equation in the smuggling enterprise. We must ask ourselves, why is it that people are paying $50,000 coming from third world countries to come in this dangerous way to Canada? Some of the people we're talking about, Madam Speaker, by the way, are actually coming from democracies like in India. Recently, CBC News did a report on individuals in Tamil Nadu, in Chennai, in the great Indian democracy, who had paid smugglers to come to Canada, and one of them said they wanted to come to Canada because they had heard that this country provides free monthly salaries. And so, Madam Speaker, that raises the question that in part, there is an economic pull factor to Canada. And also, Madam Speaker, it is very clear to us that the capacity of someone who gets landed in Canada through, for example, a positive refugee protection decision, to immediately then sponsor family members means that the $50,000 price point used by the syndicates is not just an investment on the principal applicant getting into the country, but on those family members who will then follow. So $50,000 makes sense on the smuggling market because the price point actually will allow eventually several family members to come to Canada in reasonably short order. Now, Madam Speaker, that is one of the reasons why it is important to change the business model of these particular smuggling syndicates by disincentivizing. That is why we propose that those who have been designated who have arrived in my time. Oh, okay. Those who have arrived in a smuggling event would be subject, who get a positive protection decision, would have a temporary residency in Canada for a period of 5 years. And I'd be happy to develop that further on questions, Madam Speaker. Thank you very much.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for York South Weston.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. And Madam Speaker, I'd like to thank the Minister for his overview with respect to this legislation. And as a sort of a preamble, I would like to just remind Canadians, and I think the Minister would agree, and this House would agree, that even in our Charter of Rights, which is differently applied than any charter in the world, as far as I'm aware, that even those who in fact are within Canadian waters that are not citizens and have no status still have some protection and application under the Charter of Rights. And so we should need not defend the compassion and the empathy that Canadians through our legislation have demonstrated over many, many, many decades. My question, though, is more related to what could be classified as the second option or a third option. I mean, the Minister has indicated that the protections and the full extent of natural justice will apply to those that in fact have landed, but he hasn't explored perhaps as clearly, at least from my point of view, the option that is being preferred or being pursued regionally in Southeast Asia with respect to neutral points of entry, where the same kind of examination would be pursued in order to determine those who are valid in terms of being admitted to the country. And how far we have gone with respect to evaluating a United Nations and sort of a universal approach to the same problem that other countries, and Canada in particular, is going to experience in the next number of years. Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Citizenship and Immigration.
I thank the member for his thoughtful comments and question, Madam Speaker. As I mentioned in my remarks, we have had preliminary discussions with our friends in Australia, with the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees, and with other countries about the concept of a regional protection framework in Southeast Asia that would allow for the kind of regional settlement or protection opportunities to which the member refers. We're not terribly advanced on this, Madam Speaker, I have to admit, and this is the problem. We're talking about a lot of work, both legal, diplomatic, logistical work that would have to be done with a number of countries. We are committed to pursuing that. I think one analogy for this would be the way that the Indo-Chinese boat people were dealt with in 1979, 1980, when they fled in large numbers, fleeing the communist oppression. The United Nations had established regional processing centers where they could go to have their claim assessed and then be subject to possible resettlement if they were found to be in need of protection. And of course, Canada received some 60,000 people. Having said that, this is not an easy solution, because if one creates those kinds of regional protection centers, one would have to avoid creating an overwhelming kind of magnet where a small flow of asylum seekers becomes potentially millions of people. There's no doubt, Madam Speaker, there are tens of millions of people around the world who no doubt would like the opportunity to resettle to a developed country and who feel for one reason or another that they're victims of persecution. And it's also true that many of those people are economic migrants, that there are mixed motives here. So this is a very difficult question. And frankly, it's the complexity of it tells me that this is not a viable solution to the immediate short-term pressure that we are facing from the syndicates today, which is why other action needs to be taken, which is contemplated in the bill.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Jean Lebert. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Clearly, the bill we have before us is a question of political marketing than it is an attempt to change things for the better. We've seen, in fact, that the bill was announced in Vancouver. That's where the Tamils arrived. And the minister made his remarks in English only, even though he speaks French very well. But what we see in this bill is a situation where the government is showing that it is moving with the Minister of Public Safety, not the Minister of Immigration. It's a disavowal of him. At the outset, the minister defended and debated a fair, balanced reform of the refugee system. He obtained unanimous consent of the House, negotiated with other parties. 4 months later, he's been disavowed by his own party. The Minister of Public Safety has gone forward with this bill and basically told him, well, your so-called balanced reform isn't balanced, and as a result, we have to come back with additional measures in this House. I'd like to know how the minister feels, in fact, given the remarks made by the Minister of Public Safety, the Honourable Minister. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I hear all kinds of comments about political conspiracy in his remarks. Madam Speaker, this bill clearly deals with a serious issue. It is reasonable and fair as well. Madam Speaker, I want to remind you that in Quebec, the majority of Quebecers, following the arrival of clandestine migrants, stated that they wanted to send them back to their own country. They wanted to return these illegal migrants. Who arrived via smugglers. And that, in fact, was Quebec saying that. In public opinion, their views are the strongest on that. Now, I know that the member for the Bloc Québécois is more concerned with values on the plateau and not with the ordinary Quebecers. We have to keep the confidence of Quebecers, Canadians, in our refugee system, and that is why we need measures, not rhetorics, not grandstanding. We need real measures that we can put in place to deal with smuggling of people.
Member for Trinity Spadina.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I have a few questions. How would refugees from Sri Lanka, say Tamils, how would they come as refugees to Canada? What queue would they be lining up for? Would they be lining up in Sri Lanka? No. Thailand? How are we, what is the proper way for refugees to come from Sri Lanka if they're Tamils? And the minister said that there are these criminals that he know about, he was there, and that already they have pocketed money, people are ready to go on ships. If he already know all of this information, why is it that he is not working, and he said he is working with the police in Thailand or in Asia and different parts of Asia, Southeast Asia, then why aren't the RCMP and CSIS working to have these smugglers arrested overseas? And at the end of the day, I've seen many reports that 9 out of 10 of these refugees claimants, when they leave a place in a desperate shape, they have no idea what is the asylum or the refugees policy of the country they're going to. So what policy that we establish really wouldn't make a lot of difference. If refugees are desperate, they're going to have to find
The Honourable Minister of Citizenship and
Thank the member for her questions, Madam Speaker. First of all, I think there's a premise in her first question, how would Sri Lankan refugees come to Canada, which I don't necessarily accept, which is that everyone coming to Canada in this fashion is in need of our protection, is coming here seeking protection as opposed to family reunification, economic opportunities. Quite frankly, there may be a mix of motives, but I will tell you this, that since the end of hostilities in Sri Lanka last year, some 100,000 Sri Lankan refugees who were resident in Tamil Nadu under the protection of the Indian government have returned voluntarily to Sri Lanka. That the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees has facilitated the return to Sri Lanka of many Tamils who were living temporarily in Southeast Asia. That the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees has declared that Tamils can no longer be presumed to be bona fide asylum claimants, and that, according to a survey done by the Canada Border Services Agency, the majority of successful Tamil asylum claimants in Canada have since returned, at least for visits, to the country from which they fled, claiming that they could not be there for reasons of persecution. I remind the member of the CBC's report recently, which interviewed people who had paid these networks who are living not in Sri Lanka, but in India. Madam Speaker, if they'd like to come to Canada, they are free to fill out an application to come here as an immigrant. If they are in need of protection, they are free to go and enroll at the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees. But they should not come in the worst and most dangerous way possible, which is through a smuggling syndicate, Madam Speaker.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Ajax Pickering.
Well, thank you, Madam